Now, we've got this Conservative leadership contest that's happening. I know it feels like the last one was just a few weeks ago. But inevitably, people will be looking at the direction that the Conservative Party should take, as well as the personalities that are vying for the leadership. And here's to discuss what should happen are two people whose organisations influence the thinking of different wings of the party. We have Ryan Shorthouse, who's the founder of the Conservative think tank Bright Blue, and John McDonnell, who's the Director of Strategy of the Adam Smith Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us both. Just before we start and we get into the levels of uber wonkery that we're about to get into, can I just get a 30-second pitch from both of you about what it is you kind of believe and do so that people can know the difference between you? We'll start with you, Ryan, and then move to you, John. So, Ryan, what's Bright Blue all about?
Well, we're a liberal Conservative think tank. Our aim is to defend and improve liberal society. I suppose what we would define ourselves as is pro-market rather than free market. So we think in public services and in consumer markets. Markets are often the best way of distributing resources and goods, but sometimes government and other actors are needed to make markets work more efficiently and equitably.
And in terms of the ASI, John?
Well, it's funny, actually. The way that was just defined then is not so different from what we think. So I would say that the Adam Smith Institute is a neoliberal think tank. That means that we think markets are probably the best way of generating wealth, but perhaps are not always the most efficient or effective way of distributing it.
Okay, so in terms of making you both upset, Ryan, you're a massive wet, and John, you're a big libertarian, and that's the side of the parties that you speak to. I think we've just lost John, so Ryan, we'll go with you. I mean,
you must have offended him so much, Ruth.
So much. He's just decided to walk out that door. You must think, Ryan, in terms of what's just happened, that there is an opportunity here for the kind of soul of the Conservative Party to be wrested back more to the centre part of centre-right.
Well, I think the Conservative Party has very limited room for manoeuvre now. We're sort of moving from the Trussonomics experiment, which was to have these big tax cuts funded by borrowing in the hope that that borrowing would be eventually paid for by growth of 2.5%. But the markets obviously reacted very badly to that. In particular, government borrowing has gone through the roof. It's really increased substantially, to the point where that's been totally reversed. And we're almost returning to the kind of austerity period, the sort of Cameronism of making sure that you balance the books. And that's now the prime economic consideration. Hence why the current Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is talking about tax rises and spending cuts. So actually, I think we're returning to a kind of 2010s conservatism, which is really about fiscal discipline. And I think that's the best the Tories can do. I don't think politically or economically they really can do anything bold. So the best they can do is stabilise the financial markets, regain some economic competence. But in terms of radicalism and radical ideas, I think they've shot that now.
And in terms of, Ryan, in terms of the people that are then involved, I mean, everyone's getting very excited about the idea that Boris might come back. I've always found him quite a tricky kind of figure to pin down, because he doesn't seem to, his views or some of the policies he's pursued have straddled lots of different strands of the Tory party. He's been put in place by a lot of people that you would think were of the right, but some of his big statism, straddles a lot more than that.
Yeah, it is really interesting, because he is probably the most left-wing Tory Prime Minister that we've had in terms of his fiscal policy, which was to substantially increase spending. Tax levels are at their sort of record highs. He's been very big on the environment, one of the sort of greenest Tory PMs we've had in terms of his plans around climate and conservation. And of course, levelling up is essentially a redistributive project, which is about supporting so-called left-behind people and places. So it is strange that he appeals more to the Tory right, but I think that's to do with his character, his sort of no-nonsense, not going to be too woke sort of character. And I think that's what is most appealing about Boris. But it is clear that the membership still yearn for Boris's return. But I really do think the parliamentary party, there is a good chunk of them who are dismayed at the idea of the return of Boris and really don't want to see it. So, if he is successful, I do fear quite grave division in the Tory party as a result of it.
Well, I think we've got John McDonnell back. Thank you for coming back to us, John. Sorry, we lost you there for a second. While you were away, you would have missed Ryan saying that the kind of the big bang approach of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, this idea of large tax cuts, of going for a pursuit of a 2.5% growth strategy. That's presumably something that ASI approves of greatly. It was the fact that it was going to be paid for by borrowing that you might have had a difficulty with.
Yes, that's broadly on the money. So I would say that Truss was right to identify a lack of growth as a top priority. Growth lifts our wages up, it pays for improvements to our public services and our infrastructure. If we'd had stronger growth over the last 10 years, people would not find the cost of living so difficult to deal with this winter, and our services wouldn't be struggling quite as much as they are now, and our quality of life would be better. Now, the problem with Truss is she sort of practiced a kind of anti-strategy in delivering on growth. If the Tories actually want to be the party of growth, they can't just play around with tax levers. Something the Adam Smith Institute advocated at the time around the mini budget was that they looked to VAT reform to try and cost some of those measures, and that they attempted to do targeting a bit better with their energy support scheme, such that it wouldn't subsidise wealthy people eating at swimming pools through winter, for example. So they could have saved a bit of money there. But I do think it's absolutely critical that, once we go through this period of calming the markets, that whatever party ends up being a party of government, they need to target growth as a top priority.
And in terms of the narrative then, John, that you will have heard, which is that all you Tufton Street think tanks, the IEA, yourselves, central government, all of that, that we're banging the drum for more libertarianism. You've had your shot. It hasn't worked. It's impoverished huge parts of the country. There's people that are much worse off, and actually a period of silence from you would be welcome, rather than continuing to come on and try and be really credible about all of these similar policies that have got us into this mess. And presumably you think that that's quite a simplistic way of categorising what it is that you stand for.
I would. We're going to put some work out on this later in the day, potentially. But to my mind, the Adam Smith Institute has never been behind a particular leader or not. We see ourselves as critical friends of the government, no matter what stripe. Now, to be honest, it was nice to have, a Prime Minister who was perhaps more sympathetic to our line of thinking. But if you actually look at the things that we were advocating up to the mini budget and after the mini budget, a lot of the things that we were talking about weren't in there. We never made a claim, for example, for the 45p cut, and we did argue for measures by which you could kind of cost in tax cuts. We do think it's important to reduce the tax burden. We do think it's important to sort of reorient our economy in favour of business investment, which has been chronically low in this country. But as I said before, none of this was delivered properly, and a lot of the sort of the sillier decisions made by the government were anything that we've ever advocated for.
Now, just to keep myself honest, I should probably say in the kind of radio version of a register of interest, I've actually done events for both Bright Blue and the ASI. You both take any sort of fringe politicians from around the country, wherever they land, including Scotland. Ryan, in terms of you saying that whoever comes in, there's very little room for movement. They still have to, though. They still have to lay out a medium and long-term vision. They have to have an aim to get to that everyone else can get behind. Because if you don't do that as a Prime Minister, then actually your Secretaries of State have no idea what decisions they should be taking to keep in touch with that vision.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the most immediate concern is to calm the markets and make sure that the cost of borrowing is not going through the roof. And to be honest with you, the impact of the increase in gilt yields has been for the Bank of England to push up interest rates, and mortgage rates are now going up. And to be honest, this is the sort of key Tory demographic, even in red wall seat areas in Northern England and Northern Wales. Disproportionately, people are more likely to be homeowners. And for a long time, they've had low interest rates and been able to afford nice cars and nice houses on relatively cheap finance. And now that's changed quite considerably. Not only down to the mini budget, there's other factors at play, but the mini budget certainly made it worse. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the Tories to recover confidence from those people as a result of, people have very high mortgages now, much more than 20, 30 years ago. So the change in mortgage rates means, people in the south of England paying thousands more, across the country, even hundreds more. I think the most immediate concern is to settle the financial markets and get a grip of government borrowing. But in the longer term, what they can do? I mean, I think Liz Truss was right. We need to try and catalyse economic growth, which has been very anemic, both in the UK and across the developed world for a long time. But it's not as if, this was the only government, the Liz Truss government was the only government that was thinking about economic growth. Lots of other governments have tried to do it. It's very difficult. But what I would say, what they really need to focus on is on expanding and educating the workforce. If you look at the growth rate in the 90s and noughties, a good chunk of that was down to productivity gains, but another chunk of it was down to an expansion in the workforce. So we need to look at things like increased skilled migration. We need to look at things like supporting parental employment, particularly women after they have children, particularly with the cost of childcare, and also thinking about older age employment. There's lots of people, particularly since the pandemic in the 50s and 60s, who have retired early. We really need to get people working right through their 60s into their 70s. So thinking about pensions and retirement policies, which incentivises people to do that.
Okay, Ryan, John, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both. That's Ryan Shorthouse, the founder of Bright Blue, and the Director of Strategy at the Adam Smith Institute, John McDonald.